There exists a conflagration of many of the topics that we talked about this week in the philosophy of Michel Foucault, who came up with the vocabulary of what he calls a technology of the self. Now, this is from a series of lectures in 1982 at the University of Vermont, which you may or may not be aware of. And he was at the time starting to suffer from the effects of HIV/AIDS, and he died a few years later. So his input here regarding technology and the self has to do especially with the 17s and 80s. But his main point of study, which was focused on what he called a history or a genealogy of ideas, after a book that he wrote focusing on the history of madness and the history of sexuality, led him to this vocabulary of technologies of the self. And his idea was that the rules that are made for people tend to be increasingly focused on the controlling their lives, and especially their lives at the deepest of their core. And he mentions in this lecture, as a context, we must understand that there are four major types of these so-called technologies, each a matrix of practical reason. Number one, technologies of production, which permit us to produce, transform, or manipulate things. Number two, technologies of sign systems, which permit us to use signs, meanings, symbols, or signification. Number three, technologies of power, which determine the conduct of individuals and submit them to certain ends or of domination and objectivizing of the subject. Number four, technologies of the self, which permit individuals to effect by their own means or with the help of others a certain number of operations on their bodies and souls, thoughts, conduct, and way of being, so as to transform themselves in order to attain a certain state of happiness, purity, wisdom, perfection, or immortality. And the first two technologies are, as far as he is concerned, the domain of the sciences and linguistics, and these the more important features. So, looking at the history of madness and the history of sexuality, were the technologies of power and the technologies of the self. And Foucault focuses especially on a one particular technology of the self, which is writing, and writing as confession, especially that people being able to take notes for themselves and rereading those notes, rereading their letters, are a way for people to become more aware of themselves and kind of revisiting parts of their past, kind of the aspect of data that we have mentioned previously in this class. And certainly now that we have a actual, digital technology to do this, we know that there is a whole lot of, let's say, power into making those things. People kind of taking advantage of these new technologies to take control of themselves in a way. And the larger context that he sees is that the religious systems that started in the first few centuries of our common era had to do with these technologies of the body, especially. And there was the on the one hand the technology of meditation, which allows people to focus on their thought, but there was also the opposite aspect, which was called gymnasia, which is where we get the idea of gymnasium, of training the body, which would allow people to improve their physical condition. And that had to do in those early years of Christianity, especially with a whole system of sexual deprivation, abstinence, physical prostration, and other kinds of rituals of cleanliness. The example here of monks and people of religious orders wearing these formless, non-distinguished types of cloth would let you know that those people are making that effort to hide themselves and to convey their physical appearance in a particular way. And today, which is not something that Foucault could have particularly predicted, that same idea can be found in other technologies of the self, where people are able to modify their physical appearance to, especially and increase their personal identity or their personal power. The example here of the Waria of Indonesia, who are biological men who have, as the tradition calls it, the soul of women. The name itself, Waria, is a mixing of the name of the word for woman, wanita, and the word for man, priya. So the warriors are a what we would call in anthropology a third gender category, and it encompasses people who might be cross-dressing, people who might be transgender, people who might be effeminate, and it's not as um, defined as what we think of here in the United States or even in the West generally, but their common identity is to be in between the more recognized genders. Now, in Indonesia, there is a pretty long tradition of these warriors existing in society that were observed by early anthropologists in the 20th century, where there was no such vocabulary as transgender or even third genders. So finding men and women accepting these people who had both I want to say technology, but that's not the right word here. Who had both the qualities of men and women was certainly a remarkable fact for these early anthropologists. However, as you probably know, Indonesia is a Muslim country, very largely Muslim country. And as a result of that, even though there is this historical acceptance and very well time attested, it doesn't mean that that warriors are fully um, included in Indonesian society. So you might find them working publicly jobs, and this particular picture here is from a Miss Warrior contest. So there is an established structure to be a third gender. That being said, there is also a lot of cultural judgment around this practice. Now, what this leads us to, much more than the basic sense of a technology that we have just mentioned, is that today there is new opportunity for people who identify as warrior in Indonesia to improve their body in the sense that Foucault was telling us, to make themselves much happier using the new technologies that exist here. So practices of modification have existed in Indonesia for centuries, and of course, we're talking about tattoos. We're talking about all kinds of ways in which people have been modifying their bodies for a very long time. But from conversations with Waria, I discerned that until the 1970s, they only used quote unquote traditional remedies to feminize their bodies, such as inserting objects under their blouses to create quote unquote breasts, drinking special beverages such as jamu to make the body more feminine, or eating special fruits and using scrubs to reduce their muscles. In contrast, the opening of the country to global markets and the publicity that exalts body cult has led to the current availability of new medical technologies, pharmaceutical and cosmetic products, and the popularization of body modifications in all of Indonesia, especially among youth and warrior. Largely, warrior and Yogyakarta have been consuming silicone regularly since the 1990s. In contrast to other countries such as Brazil, there is no injection facility in public hospitals, and body modifications are often socially and politically criminalized. To overcome these hurdles, Warrior and Yogyakarta have developed three main strategies to include their silicones into their body. And of course, this particular article goes into the techniques or technologies or strategies that are used for people to adopt their body. And we're going to talk about that more in a second. The most important part here is the fact that there is this, very conscious effort to change and adopt a body that matches the soul and kind of this vocabulary of what used to be a natural remedy, which is drinking special beverages, which is to scrub your muscles, etc. Things that seem to be a personal practice to change your natural body with the change of a more commercialized version, a more perhaps artificial, although arguably there is a pretty fine line here between the artificial self body modification and the commercial self body modification. But the idea that the digital world has made those new technologies available to an age-old practice of improving oneself is very much a new development in how this may or may not affect our health. Now, the part of the description that is given in the same article here is senior warrior assert that body was also relevant in the past, though it was conceived as an unalterable, quote unquote, natural gift. Again, this used to be somewhat of the vocabulary of nature and not so much understood as a cultural item. However, with the emergence of the mentioned neoliberal ideologies in Indonesia, beauty has transformed as a category associated with individual status, symbolizing property, modernity, and distinction, but rivalry, jealousy, and greed as well. The opening of the post-Suharto era made possible the visibility and marketing of various forms of sexualities, gender expressions, and sexual desires. These current social cultural dynamics materialize in the celebration of warriors' beauty pageants to have become popular in Indonesia, kind of the Miss Warrior pageant that I was just showing a second ago. The opening of cabaret places where drag queens perform, the appearance of warrior who are idolized by thousands of people on social networks for being fashion icons, and increasing interest of warrior in transforming their appearances. Today, generally young warriors spend considerable time and money watching makeup tutorials on YouTube, sharing selfies on Instagram, trying new cosmetics, buying fashionable clothes for Facebook, or seeking quote unquote miracle pills to lose weight on the internet. So, to a certain extent, there is certainly a positive aspect to people working on becoming their true self, the person that they feel that they are or that they feel their soul corresponds to. But as you can see, this also means engaging in practices that we today would consider to be a little bit more surface and a little bit more commercialized, again, attached to neoliberal ideologies, which is not necessarily considered as a net positive in most circles, especially if they become absorbed or spend enormous amounts of money or even get scammed using those quote unquote miracle pills to lose weight. So, in the sense that there is a process of an identity being developed, the technologies being available today are certainly helping people bridge that gap between what their soul is and what their uh, physical life corresponds to. But of course, this is in this case a matter that is very personal and sometimes intimate, not necessarily something that people would consider to be a fundamental aspect of society. But that's not to say that it is also not possible to use technology to improve your functional appearance, as the example here of a self-made prosthetic for someone who had lost their fingers in an industrial accident and created with machinery their own fingers to be able to control and have a possibility to grip things at work. And in this case, of course, this is a form of prosthetics or a form of technology of self that is well accepted, that has a existence, that also has a precedent in pre-industrial technologies. We have been using prosthetics for a very long time, especially for war victims. And in that context, of course, the new development of digital technologies is a natural progression from what existed before in perhaps less accessible, perhaps more expensive, and probably more crude fashions in other domains. And you can certainly extend that to a much larger system of the medical context that exists for everyone who needs to have a little bit of help or a little bit of assistance in making their true natural self, if you will, more functional, such as in the case here of a whole machinery designed for personal training and for rehabilitation of muscles. Now, this is obviously a very elaborate, very expensive, very functional machine, but this is something that is helping people today and become more proficient humans, become happier humans, and probably helping their families as well cope with a physical loss that a few years ago would have been probably just as devastating and perhaps just as expensive to remedy. So, in terms of finding a technology of the self for yourself, the digital world is increasing people's access to the more varied aspects of technology that allow anyone to become everyone, essentially from the point of view of a technology of the self created by a larger system, including from a medical standpoint, perhaps a government standpoint, the possibility of using digital technology to improve the well being of society as a whole or individual families little by little is also greatly improved by the fact that technology is becoming more and more accessible. Now, certainly, as we mentioned, in the context of surveillance, there is the possibility of these patents being abused, for example, or of the software being modified for more or less access. And this is a realistic conversation that we could have today, but it still contributes to this much larger context that we are talking about of the technology of the self.